Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really tough one, a case that's cast a long shadow over Austin, Texas. The unsolved 1991 yogurt shop killings.
Yeah, 4 young women tragically lost their lives in, well, a truly horrific crime.
And we're going to look at quite a few different sources here
Right.
to try and understand the key aspects of this mystery that just won't go away, why it still troubles people so much.
Exactly. And for you, the listener, if you're drawn to, understanding complex events, their impact, this case definitely demands a closer look.
So what sources are we drawing on?
We've pulled together information from Wikipedia, naturally, but also news outlets like People, the Austin American-Statesman, Oxygen True Crime, too.
Okay, a good mix.
Yeah, the idea is to get different perspectives, different levels of detail.
And our goal here, our sort of mission for this deep dive,
It's really to cut through all the noise, all the speculation, and just extract the most crucial information about the killings themselves, the long investigation.
and all those questions that are still hanging out there.
Precisely. Those lingering questions.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. The awful night itself, December 6th, 1991.
The setting was the I can't believe it's yogurt shop in Austin.
And the victims,
Yeah.
it's just heartbreaking to list them. Amy Ayers, only 13. Eliza Thomas, 17. And sisters Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, 17 and 14.
Jennifer and Eliza, they were working that night.
Yeah, they were the employees on shift. Sarah and Amy were just there waiting to get a ride home after closing time, which was 11.000 p.m.
It just shows how fast the ordinary
Wait,
Friday. Into this. Unimaginable.
and there were some strange details from just before closing time, weren't there?
There were little things that maybe didn't seem like much then, but now, well, like about an hour before closing, there was a man who'd been outside apparently trying to get customers in.
Okay.
He was allowed to use the back toilet and reportedly stayed in there for quite a long time.
Which raised suspicion later.
Yeah, speculation that maybe he jammed the back door open, something like that.
Huh.
And then there was a couple leaving just moments before 11 p.m. They saw 2 other men inside, sitting at a table, acting kind of furtively, suspiciously.
2 unidentified men.
Never identified. These little details, they just hang there,
Yeah.
Potentially significant, but leading nowhere concrete.
And then the discovery. Just horrific.
Around midnight, yeah. A police officer on patrol noticed a fire at the shop.
Called it in immediately.
Right. Firefighters arrived, put out the blaze, and that's when they found them, the 4 girls.
The details of how they were found are just brutal.
Unbelievably so. All 4 were nude. All had been shot in the head.
Oh, God.
Sarah, Eliza, and Jennifer. They'd been gagged and bound with their own underwear, and they were severely charred by the fire.
Just awful. And Amy.
Amy was found in a separate area of the shop, not charred to the same extent, but she had extensive burns, 2nd and 3rd degree, covering maybe 25–30% of her body.
And she'd also been shot.
Twice. The one bullet apparently missed her brain. It's just, the sheer brutality is staggering.
And the weapons.
Evidence pointed to 2 different guns being used. A .22 caliber and a .380 pistol.
2 guns. That suggests more than one person, maybe. Or at least planning.
It certainly points that way. And then there was the DNA evidence. Male DNA was recovered, indicating at least one of the girls had been raped.
Adding another layer of horror.
And the fire itself,
Yeah.
clearly arson, deliberately set to destroy evidence. It burned incredibly hot. Apparently melted part of a metal ladder inside.
Wow. So not a random act.
No, definitely not. It felt calculated. Intended to cover tracks.
So the initial investigators looking at all this, the control, the weapons, the arson, what were they?
Their initial assessment, based on those elements, was that this pointed towards an adult perpetrator. Someone experienced in crime. Organized.
Not necessarily teenagers acting impulsively.
Right. That was the initial thought that kind of shaped the early investigation.
Which is interesting because the first real suspects they looked into were quite young, weren't they?
That's true. Despite that initial profile, they did investigate a 15-year-old boy. He was caught nearby, not long after, with a .22 pistol.
The same caliber as one of the murder weapons?
Exactly. But ballistics eventually showed it wasn't the murder weapon. So he and 3 of his friends, all under 17, were looked at closely, but ultimately ruled out.
Shows the pressure, I guess. You find a kid with a gun nearby, you have to check it out.
Absolutely. But ruling them out meant the case remained wide open. And then years passed.
Right, and this is where the whole story takes a really significant and pretty troubling turn.
Yes. Years later, a new detective comes onto the case. Detective Hector Polanco, and he develops a new theory.
Focusing on 4 different young men who were teenagers back in 1991.
Exactly. By this time, they were in their 20s. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn. They became known as the Austin Four.
And this new theory led to interrogation.
It did. And this is where it gets really controversial. Confessions were obtained from Springsteen and Scott.
Okay, so confessions. That seems like a breakthrough.
Well, yes and no. The huge problem was there were absolutely no records of the initial police interviews with these same individuals back in 1991, shortly after the crime.
No records at all.
No. Which immediately raised massive red flags. How were these later confessions obtained? Was information, perhaps, suggested to them, fed to them?
You can't verify what they knew independently back then versus what they were told years later.
Precisely. And despite this lack of corroborating physical evidence connecting them to the scene, Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen were put on trial.
Based almost entirely on these confessions.
Pretty much. The prosecution, of course, detailed the horrific nature of the crime, but the case against these specific men hinged on those statements they made years later.
And they were.
Scott was sentenced to death in 2001. Springsteen got life in prison in 2002, partly because he was younger at the time of the crime.
Wow, but those convictions didn't last.
No, they didn't. They were appealed. And this is where the legal specifics get important. The issue was the confrontation clause of the Constitution.
Okay, how did that apply?
Basically, during their separate trials, the prosecution used parts of Springsteen's alleged confession against Scott and parts of Scott's against Springsteen.
But neither defendant testified, right? So they couldn't be cross-examined by the other's lawyer.
Exactly. You can't do that. It violates the right to confront your accuser.
So the appeals were successful.
Yes. Springsteen's conviction was overturned in 2006, Scott's in 2009.
And they were released.
Released on bond in 2009, yeah, after years in prison.
A huge legal failing, clearly.
And then came the DNA evidence. This was really the nail in the coffin for the case against them.
What did the DNA show?
Forensic testing, done years after the trials, obviously, showed that the male DNA found on one of the victims, it didn't match Scott. It didn't match Springsteen.
Or the other 2, Pierce or Wellborn.
No, it excluded all 4 of them.
That's definitive.
Absolutely. It directly contradicted the confessions, which had implicated all 4 working together.
So what happened then?
The prosecution had no choice, really.
Yeah.
In October 2009, they announced they were dropping all charges against Scott and Springsteen. No retrial.
Just dismissed. After all that time, you'd imagine there'd be compensation for wrongful conviction.
You would think so. But the Texas courts actually ruled they weren't entitled to compensation.
Why not?
The reasoning was kind of technical and, frankly, harsh. The court said that while their convictions were overturned on legal grounds, they hadn't technically proven their innocence to the standard required by the Texas compensation statute.
Wow, that's a tough distinction. Innocent in the eyes of the law for the crime, but not proven innocent enough for compensation.
It's a very fine line. And it highlights the difficulties exonerees face.
And the detective involved, Polanco?
Yeah.
There were issues there too.
Yes, adding another layer of concern. Detective Hector Polanco, who got the confessions. He'd previously been accused of coercing false confessions in a completely different case.
Seriously?
Yeah, a case where the defendants were also later exonerated after spending years in prison. So, that history obviously cast a huge shadow over the Yogurt confessions.
Understandably. Did the jurors ever weigh in on that?
Incredibly, yes. 7 jurors from the original Scott and Springsteen trials later said publicly that if they'd known about the DNA results, the fact that it excluded them would not have happened.
That says everything.
It really speaks volumes about how weak the case was without those confessions and how crucial that DNA evidence became.
So the Austin 4 theory completely collapsed.
Laterally, based on the science.
Yeah.
But it left the central question unanswered. Who did commit this horrific crime?
So the investigation had to keep going, looking elsewhere.
Right. Back to square one in some ways, but with the case now even older.
Did they look at other known criminals? Like serial killers active then?
They did. Kenneth McDuff was a notorious serial killer operating in that area around that time. He targeted teenagers. He was definitely
Or
considered.
ruled out.
Eventually, yes. Based on the evidence they had, they didn't believe it was him.
And what about other confessions? You hear about that in big cases.
Oh, absolutely. And this case had a staggering number. Over 50 people confessed to the murders over the years.
50?
Yeah, including McDuff himself, apparently on the day he was executed for his other crimes.
Why do people do that? False confessions.
It's complex. Sometimes mental illness, sometimes a desire for attention, sometimes maybe coercion or misunderstanding during questioning. But it massively complicates investigations, wastes time.
I can imagine. Any other specific confessions that seemed plausible for a time?
There were a couple early on. In 1992, two Mexican nationals confessed. But that was quickly ruled false. They claimed they had been tortured into confessing. And another one in 92, a guy named Porfirio Villa Saavedra, apparently the leader of a motorcycle gang nicknamed the Terminator.
The Terminator.
He confessed too. But then he recanted, also claimed torture, and investigators ultimately ruled him out as well.
So just more dead ends and confusion.
Pretty much. And then there's the lingering mystery of those two unidentified customers.
Right. The one seen acting out of place just before closing.
Exactly. Police even tried using hypnosis on other patrons later, trying to get better descriptions.
Did it work?
Apparently not. Those two men were never identified. They remain just unknown figures who were there right at the crucial time. Could they have seen something? Could they have been involved? We just don't know.
Which brings us back to the physical evidence, mainly the DNA.
Yes, the DNA has been both the biggest hope and, in some ways, the biggest frustration in this case.
How so?
Well, initially, back in the 90s, they recovered that partial male DNA profile from one of the victims. But with technology then, it only yielded about 16 genetic markers.
Not enough for a positive ID.
Not enough to pinpoint one person. It was useful for excluding people, like it eventually excluded the Austin 4, but not for identifying the actual donor.
The technology improved, right.
Dramatically. And this led to a potentially huge development in 2017.
What happened then?
Investigators were able to match that partial profile to an unidentified individual whose DNA was already in the FBI's CODIS database.
CODIS. So likely someone previously arrested or convicted. That sounds like the break they needed.
You'd think so, but here's the massive frustration. The FBI refused to reveal the identity of that person,
They refused. Why?
citing privacy concerns. Apparently, the reason this person's DNA was in the database might have been related to something other than a conviction for a specific type of crime, or maybe they were a victim in another case. The FBI wouldn't clarify, just said privacy rules prevented disclosure.
That must have been agonizing for the families. To know there's a match, but you can't get the name.
Unbelievably agonizing. It's been a major point of contention ever since. Before that, actually, back in 2008, they did YSTR testing.
What's that?
It looks specifically at male DNA markers, and that testing confirmed the presence of DNA from at least one unknown male, consistent with the partial profile.
Okay. And more recently, any more progress?
Well, in 2022, there were reports that even newer, more advanced DNA technology, things like forensic genealogy perhaps, were being applied.
Bringing them closer.
That was the hope expressed.
Yeah.
That these new techniques could finally develop a full profile, or maybe make sense of that partial FBI hit. Whether it has yet, we don't have confirmation.
It just highlights how crucial science is, but also how sometimes legal or bureaucratic hurdles get in the way.
Absolutely. The potential is there, locked in that database, perhaps identifiable with new tech, but access and application remain.
This case, the sheer length of it and the suffering of the families, it actually led to legislative changes, didn't it?
It did, which is quite a legacy in a way. The Homicide Victims Families' Rights Act,
Signed into law.
August 2022, and it was directly motivated by the decades-long fight with the Yogurt Shop victims' families.
What does the act do?
It essentially gives families in federal court cases, or cases with federal involvement, the right to petition the government to reopen the case file.
To ensure a fresh look.
Yes, and specifically to request that the latest forensic technologies be applied, things that weren't available years ago.
That seems incredibly important for cases like this. A way to force a re-examination with new tools.
It's a recognition that justice shouldn't have an expiration date, and that families deserve access to potential breakthroughs.
And the impact on Austin itself. This case is just woven into the city's fabric now, isn't it?
Deeply. It's still considered one of the most heinous, shocking crimes in Austin's history. It left a scar.
And people are still trying to tell the story, keep the memory alive.
Definitely, there have been several books, Beverly Lowry's Who Killed These Girls, Corey Mitchell's Murdered Innocents, even a novel inspired by it, Scott Blackwood's See How Small.
And a documentary series, too.
Yes, a big one. 4 episodes called The Yogurt Shop Murders. It premiered at South by Southwest, the festival in Austin,
Fitting.
and it's slated for HBO Max in 2025. Apparently, it focuses a lot on the victims, their families, the lasting trauma.
That's important, to remember the human cost.
Absolutely. These cultural works, they keep the names Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah in the public consciousness. They remind people that this isn't solved.
Before we wrap up, there's one other sort of footnote to the Austin 4 part of the story. Maurice Pierce.
Right. One of the 4 men initially implicated through those confessions.
What happened to him?
Sadly, he died back in 2010. He was shot and killed by a police officer during a traffic stop. Apparently, he had a knife.
Just another layer of tragedy surrounding this whole saga.
It really is. Just adds to the heartbreaking complexity.
So let's try to pull the threads together here as we finish this deep dive. What are the absolute core takeaways?
Okay, well first, the horrific, brutal murders of 4 young women still unsolved after over 30 years.
Then the deeply flawed investigation focusing on the Austin 4 based on questionable confessions.
Right, leading to convictions that were ultimately overturned, thankfully, largely due to the lack of corroborating evidence and constitutional issues.
And the crucial role of DNA both in clearing the wrongly accused and now holding the key potentially to the
But an incomplete key so far, with that frustrating FBI database situation and the hope pinned on newer technologies.
And finally, the ongoing search for answers, driven by the families, reflected in legislation, and kept alive in the public eye through books and documents.
For you, the listener, I think this case just starkly illustrates the challenges of cold case work. You know, memories fade, evidence degrades.
Human error, bias, it can creep in.
Definitely. And the constant race between forensic technology improving and time running out.
And it really shows the profound, lasting pain that unsolved crimes inflict, not just on the immediate families, but on a whole community. It's a wound that doesn't close.
No, it doesn't. Oh.
So on that somber note, maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on after this. Given everything we've discussed, the decades gone by, the incredible leaps in forensic tech, the new laws, what single piece of evidence, maybe something overlooked back then, or what detail, what innovative approach not yet tried? What do you think holds the most potential now? What might finally crack this case and bring some measure of peace, some closure to this terrible tragedy after all this time?
It makes you think, doesn't it? What tiny thread might unravel the whole thing?
Yeah, something to ponder. The search for justice, even when it seems almost impossible, it never really stops.